Hey, welcome to the show. If this is your first time tuning in, this is EpiSTEM. And what EpiSTEM means is exploring papers in science, technology, engineering, and math. We made that word up from the word episteme, which is a philosophical term that refers to knowledge, science, or understanding. The purpose of this podcast is for us to read research papers and digest them and hopefully let you know about the information from those research papers and just learn about the research that's happening in the world that most people don't know about.
Yes, sir.
Today we'll be looking at a paper titled Intelligent Control of Micropower, Immortal Machine. It'll be published in Nanoenergy in their 72nd volume this June.
So a little bit of clarification on what we said there in the intro. What is an immortal machine? So I think first it's important to understand what's a mortal machine. So this is your day-to-day machine, probably what you're used to interacting with. It's a machine that would require a battery or a constant supply of energy. It operates until it's out of energy, kind of like a flashlight. It'll just keep going until it's dead. And it will depend on an operator to stay functional.
Almost every machine in the world right now is it could be considered a mortal machine. But what does machine learning, renewable energy, and microcontrollers all have in common? Well, two professors at the University of Essex believe that those are the ingredients for making a machine that they want to call immortal.
And going off that, an immortal machine, it doesn't require oversight. So it would manage its own resources wisely, and it would dictate its output based on the available input. So back to the flashlight scenario, instead of just going until it ran out of energy, maybe it would stop shining light or shine a slightly dimmer light so it could make its battery last longer. It'll stay on for just as long as it physically can.
You may wonder, why do you want an immortal machine? Well, with all mortal machines, which are machines that are out in the workplace right now, you have to pay upkeep costs to do maintenance on the machines, which is a pointless expenditure of time and money for a company. In lean manufacturing, they have a term called muda, which is a Japanese word that roughly is equivalent to waste. So with lean manufacturing, you want to remove the waste within the system, and having to go and do maintenance on a machine all the time creates a lot of extra waste and a lot of extra time that you waste on the machine itself.
Yeah, and I've seen that in my own experience, how line downtime can cost companies up to millions of dollars. When it comes down to it, what we really see is the whole immortal machine idea is more about optimizing the limited energy resources with intelligent control.
This paper explores what it would take to make
the Immortal Machine.
So the first priority of an immortal machine would be a renewable and reliable power supply. If you consider something like a solar cell, it can provide a smaller voltage for a long period of time or a large voltage in a short period of time. If you know about how much power your application needs over time, and you know how much power your panel can supply, it's pretty simple to calculate the sleep-to-wake ratio of your system.
Speaking of sleep-to-wake ratio, the researchers made a lot of correlations between living things and machines. One of those main things is staying alive. Humans and other animals would like to stay alive, and so do machines. A first priority of any code is to make sure that the machine and the system itself doesn't overrun and it doesn't short itself. Another correlation they made is work when possible. So a system wants to work as much as possible and use its energy efficiently and use what it can, whatever resources it has. Same as any human or other animal, they don't want to be lazy. As a human, it's ingrained in you to work hard and to strive for something. Another thing that living things and machines have in common is that they want to sustain themselves. So with a living thing, they sustain themselves through eating, which eventually gives them energy through the digestive system. And a machine acquires energy through some kind of voltage source, whether it be renewable or non-renewable. But in the Immortal Machine, we want it to be renewable so that there doesn't need to be any upkeep.
You can think of this idea of accumulating up energy over time kind of like saving up money for a big purchase, while also considering your daily cost of living.
Feast and famine are very much related with living things and machines also, because a machine wants to be able to have a power supply that's abundant so that it can maximize its work and save up energy. But if it's lacking in energy, it's going to need to have to save critical data, and it gives a warning to go into a sleep mode. Another correlation they had was maturity. So with maturity, a system wants to learn patterns of its power supply and load requirements to be able to predict and optimize its performance. A system will also set variables using hard coding or utilize machine learning within its code to obtain those variables.
Hard coding, for those of you that don't know, is when you program in a fixed value for a system parameter versus letting it change as the system changes over time.
In an adaptive system, you don't want to use hard coding because there are environmental variables that will be changing day to day or year to year depending on the system. So you're going to want the system to change its variables with those environmental changes.
So the researchers took the last several pages of the paper to go into how you can save a lot of power by predicting your voltage levels. It makes sense that a system that's based on charging and discharging a capacitor would need to be aware of how much voltage is in the capacitor at a given time. Because capacitors charge predictably, you only really need to collect 2 data points on the curve, and you can calculate how much time is left before it's fully charged.
The curve that he's referring to is the change of voltage over time of the capacitor, which includes the charging and the discharging cycles.
Collecting data this way is intentionally different than a typical approach, which would be like periodically collecting data points every 10 milliseconds or so. This is pretty ineffective if you consider the fact that you're not gaining anything by taking additional measurements. You already know the behavior of the capacitor as it charges. You can wake the controller up just long enough to take 2 measurements, and then you can calculate how much longer it has before it's time to wake up and do work. Think of this as setting an alarm to get up in the morning. If you know that you need to get up at 6 a.m., there are 2 ways you can do it. The most common way would be to set an alarm for 6 a.m. You go to bed at 10 o'clock, your alarm goes off at 6 a.m., you know it's going to go off, you get up then, you get the maximum amount of time to sleep if you do it that way. But if you wake up every 30 minutes and check the clock until it's 6 a.m., you'll still get up at 6 a.m., but you'll spend most of your time waking up and going to sleep, which will take a lot of energy, and I guarantee you'll be much more tired when the morning comes. That's analogous to how you can save power on taking capacitor voltage readings. So instead of just periodically taking measurements on the voltage and waiting until it reaches a fully charged level, take a few points off the graph, just enough for you to make a prediction on what time the capacitor will be ready, and take the rest of that time to sleep and save energy.
If you overstrain yourself, you won't be able to do the activities that you had planned for the day. Just as with the system, if the system is overstrained, it's not going to perform the duties that it needs to do, and thus it will be an inefficient and ineffective system.
Alright, so this is Nerd Notes. This is where we go into a little bit further detail on some of the more technical sections of the report, just to get a little bit of extra
information and extra information based on the calculations that they did, because the first part of the podcast we don't really go that in depth into all the actual calculations and research that's done by these people. So we're really not trying to take credit for their work or dumb it down in a way. We're just trying to regurgitate the simpler portions, and here's where we're going to talk about more of the math related and other calculations that were made within their research.
Right, some of the numbers and whatnot. So one point that I'd like to make is if you were listening and you were thinking about the parasitic load that the microcontroller itself would have on the system, that is something that the report goes into further detail on. So obviously the big way that you control the load that the microcontroller is putting on the system, the biggest way you do that is controlling the sleep cycles, which we talked a little bit about. You know, maximizing how much time it spends asleep. Whenever the microcontroller is in the sleep mode, it consumes an almost negligible amount of power. But the important thing is that it never falls below 1.8 volts, because that's the level at which it can no longer retain its active memory, or its RAM. So another way that you can control the power and minimize it is by turning off a lot of the included peripherals on the microcontroller itself. So a lot of microcontrollers come with functions built into them that are always running, unless you say otherwise. such as an analog to digital converter or other math functions that are built within the microcontroller that may not be necessary for your system. So if you turn those off, you can save a lot of energy. You might also think, why not just turn the controller off entirely when it's in a sleep mode or when it's not necessary? The reason you wouldn't want to do that is because starting the microcontroller from 0 volts, getting it past that 1.8 volt minimum from the bottom from 0 volts requires a lot more energy than you might think, and it could be more current than the source can provide. So to avoid that, since considering the fact that this system doesn't necessarily know exactly when it might turn back on, if it's just waiting for the power supply to come back, you don't really know if you're going to have those the capacity to provide that much power. So it's best to just leave it in sleep mode and don't let it turn off all the way. Yeah, that's about all there is to that.
So a crucial part of the system that we didn't exactly talk about, when the system's trying to optimize itself, a big part of that is calculating a tau value, and the tau values are needed for when it's charging and when it's discharging. So to calculate those, the system that they made multiplies the impedance values, the equivalent impedance values and the capacitance value of the system, and then it calculates tau from there, and it'll do that 2 times within a cycle, once when it's charging, once when it's discharging, and the whole cycle will work together to be able to optimize the system to have the perfect amount of, well, not perfect amount, but the best amount of rest time and active time. Another thing we can go more in depth into is how they compared their measurements of continuous measuring versus non-continuous measuring, as in staggered measuring of the voltages within the system. So they both have their pros and cons, but the big cons of a regular sampling approach will be a decreased efficiency within the system, and that's due to the system being woken up and then going back to sleep so often that it's just decreasing its efficiency in general. And also, with every time you wake up the system and put it back to sleep, that also adds more strain on the system by causing more load to be used, and that will cause the system to reach the target that it wants to reach at a slower rate. One thing the researchers talked about at the end of their paper is about the diurnal and long-term cycles of the system. So with the calculations they made in MATLAB, they don't account for changes within a day or possibly a year for whatever it may be, whatever the voltage source is. It can be sunlight in a renewable energy sense. There's differing amounts of sunlight during the day and season, so they don't really account for that in the calculations, but hopefully the system itself would be able to optimize that and eventually average out to a good level of charging to discharging rates.
We spent some time talking about the similarities between an immortal machine and a living being. And one thing that's kind of important to think about is the death scenario. So this would happen if voltage supplied to the system was getting critically low and it didn't foresee any fresh power coming in anytime soon. And it would drop below that 1.8 volts and lose important data. So in that scenario, what you would want your system to do is basically write all of that, or store all of that data that's the important information of the state of the system that's in RAM, put it into ROM, so that if the system does die and you do revive it or take that data, you can pick back up where you left off, so to speak, and the important data you have doesn't get lost.
Thank you for listening to the podcast today. All of the information here came from a research paper, Intelligent Control of Micropower, Immortal Machine. The research paper will be published this June in the 72nd volume of Nanoenergy. The researchers that did the research within the paper are Michael Walton and Dr. John Woods of the University of Essex.